Do you think League will ever get to the point where we have more alternate win conditions over team fighting or split pushing? Something more like cutting supply lines or more unique ways to win the game? Holy boy, that is a great question. The question was, what about alternate win conditions in League of Legends? And here's the complexity there. So in League, there's generally, let's say, two ways to win the game in a really abstract sense. There is team fighting and split pushing, and usually team fighting is a lot more powerful. Split pushing tends to be on the weaker end. And I'm sure there's other things you could put in there, but like, you know, for the sake of argument, let's talk about team fighting, right? One of the things you have to do when you're balancing the game is you have to make sure that the ways to succeed in the game are ways players want to succeed. So, hyperbolic example, I have made a new win condition for League of Legends. If you go to Baron, you can play Bejeweled. And if you get a high score of 20,000 or more playing Bejeweled at Baron, the enemy Nexus explodes. So if you ever see the enemy jungler pull out their Game Boy and start chilling in the Baron pit, you need to go stop them from playing Bejeweled. Right? Like, that's an alternate win condition, right? That's an alternate win condition. But it's probably the case that many players, if they saw that being the win condition, would be like, what the heck is this game? I did not sign up to play Bejeweled, and that's how the game wins. And a lot of players, quite honestly, feel this way about split pushing. A lot of players, when split pushing is too powerful, are like, this isn't a League of Legends that I want to play. Because I wanted to play a League of Legends where I interact with my opponents, and split pushing is an inherently non-interactive strategy. When it works, it's usually one champion running away from you constantly, right? And so, and that can be very, very frustrating and feel like the game kind of is broken and doesn't make sense. And so with any alternate win condition you do, you need to find something that feels as valid and as enjoyable to some degree as team fighting, right? And so when you lose the alternate win condition as a player, you're like, okay, that was valid. Like, one of the ways you lose in League of Legends is the enemy gets Infernal Dragon Soul, right? Sorry, not Infernal Drake, Dragon Soul. And that generally feels a fairly valid way to lose the game. You're like, yeah, they stacked it over 30 minutes and they got it. Okay, we lose, we get it, right? And so that's a complexity because there's a lot of alternate win conditions we could add to the game that would make the game worse, right? And so one of the reasons that we haven't really expanded a ton on alternate win conditions over the years is because a number of times when we do it, the game gets worse. So here's an alternate win condition we tested on Aurelion Sol. You know Aurelion Sol's Calamity? The big meteor that does the whole AoE shockwave? At one point, whenever he dropped that Calamity, it did 10% of the health of all the enemy towers in Nexus. Or some percentage of it. And so, if you were playing Aurelion Sol, and you just kept dropping Calamities, eventually the game would end because his Calamities would just destroy all of the enemy structures. And that was something like we tested out. And we fairly quickly realized that it was somewhat low satisfaction for Aurelion Sol, while being fairly frustrating for his opponents. Because his opponents were like, I thought the win condition was kill the dragon and push into their base and defend from the dragon. I didn't realize the win condition was Aurelion Sol just keeps farming and keeps dropping stars until our Nexus explodes, right? And so, like, we moved away from it. But it's just kind of an example of, you know, thematically it was cool. You're dropping meteors, like them destroying buildings is exciting, right? But it felt like an invalid way for Aurelion Sol to win the game. When his opponents lost to that kind of strategy, they weren't like, okay, he earned it. They were like, what? But that, what? Right? And so that is the thing you really have to think about when you're trying to find alternate win conditions. And it's challenging. It's like, you're going against people's, like, you know, up to like a decade or more experience. Like, the way you win League of Legends is by team fighting and beating each other up that way. And so alternate win conditions have to ensure that they don't feel like they've made the game worse based off of that foundation. Doesn't mean we can't do them, just kind of noting that they can be challenging. And the overall design lesson here, just because there's like different ways to win the game or different things you can do, doesn't necessarily mean those ways are good for the game. And so as a designer, one of the things you're tasked with is making sure that the powerful winning things are also things that generally like fit in like what a player would want to do to win, or perhaps what a player would want to experience to. Why does the balancing team talk so much about willing to let players have freedom in the items they buy and then go nerf things like AD Scion? So this is actually a really hard space. So the question was basically like, y'all say that you want to give people item choices and then you nerf all the item choices, is what the person is basically saying. And I think it's a hard balancing act because you're running into two things. You're running into give players cool choices, which is a very valuable thing to do. I generally like that. And you're running into the game is balanced and feels fair. And so like as an example, let's use AP Kog'Maw as an example. We could buff AP Kog'Maw to be truly viable. But then there's this question of like, is the game better having AP Kog'Maw in it? Because AP Kog'Maw shelling you from off your screen can be a little messed up. AP Kaisa, same thing. AP Zeri, right? Like, we actually have the tools and the ability to make a lot of off-builds for a lot of characters very, very viable and functional. But one of the hard parts is, like, AP Kaisa tends to feel less fair than AD Kaisa. AD Scion tends to feel, when it actually works, a lot more messed up than normal Scion. AP Kog'Maw tends to feel a lot more messed up than normal Kog'Maw, right? And so the balancing act here is on one hand giving players choice and creative expression, and on the other hand it's like, well, are we willing to tolerate these more frustrating patterns in the game? And what kind of like comes with tolerating the more frustrating, like what comes with giving players that variety is tolerating the more frustrating patterns. It would be like, say, a more Dota-like approach. I would argue Dota does this. Dota tends to say, it is okay if the pattern's frustrating. Here's how you play against it. Get good. Hashtag. And then, like, you know, you can just do some really, really crazy stuff in that game. Whereas the league balancing strategy over the years has tended to be a bit more on the side of be careful about what you add that's too frustrating. And so we tend to look at things like AP Kog'Maw and be like, I don't know if that's like one of the things we should truly be encouraging here. And so it's just really a question of a cost of that creativity and expression that comes from alternate builds often means that many of those alternate builds are like a bit more degenerate than the main build. And it has to come with like an acceptance of that frustration.